kiss for you.
Hey, so it's been a while here, and in an effort to try and make videos, I guess, at a quicker pace, I'm going to be trying to do a couple of these kind of shorter, less heavily edited videos in the process of doing my normal reviews and that kind of stuff. So today we're really going to be talking about less of a deep dive, more of a discussion about MacBook Pro and my kind of experience with my MacBook Pro currently as it stands from when I did my review back in 2018 to how it holds up about 2.5, 3 years later, because a bunch of people were actually asking me about that. So let's so first thing I want to really talk about again, revisiting this thing, is just talk about some of the things that I thought held up well and some things I thought didn't hold up well about the MacBook Pro. So first thing I want to talk about is battery life. Of course, after a certain amount of time, the battery life eventually of any product, as you keep charging it and stuff, eventually fades and falls, especially with the introduction, having this be the first, I think, year that they had the touch bar on the MacBook Pro, new model for that, how that's, affected battery life. So when I first got my MacBook Pro, I think I rated it for about 8.5 hours of battery life, somewhere around there, 8.5 to 9 hours, which is pretty good. And one of the reasons I actually bought a Mac was because I knew that they had pretty consistent battery life, throughout the long term. It wasn't just gonna die instantly like my old HP did, where it went from 8 hours to 2. And yeah, I can pretty much say that's how it's been with this MacBook Pro. It's gone from 8.5 hours to about 8 hours, so it is dropped a little bit, but it's not really noticeable, and I don't really have any metric other than knowing how far a day goes and stuff. But it does obviously depend on what you're doing. If you're just on the web or on Chrome, Safari, a lot of that stuff, it's not going to be as impacted as if you're doing a bunch of editing or that kind of stuff, which I ended up doing as just a test. And yeah, of course, it just completely drains the battery. So if you're doing a lot of work intensive stuff, it drains the battery quite quickly, but that's under any laptop. So if you're just doing normal, word processing, checking emails, that kind of stuff, photo editing as well doesn't really hinder it. It's really just things that require the GPU or the whatever qualifies as a GPU to work. So things like video editing, music, that kind of stuff. Or music creation, I should say. But other than that, battery life has been holding up pretty well. So next thing I want to talk about, the keyboard, the dreaded butterfly keyboard. Yeah, pretty mad about it, actually. Like everyone else, it's clearly a problem, and I'm not just saying it's a problem. I've actually experienced the whole thing of multiple key presses and stuff. It's actually pretty noticeable in the space bar, actually, for me, more than a couple others. I think E was there that got a little bit, every time you press it, it would actually press twice. Not every time, but eventually you press it twice. But it's the space bar, really, that I've noticed it happening a lot, where I'll click on the space bar and it'll double or triple tap faces, which is kind of annoying. And also just the general feeling of the keyboard isn't great, especially when you're again typing for long amounts of time. It kind of gets annoying and that kind of stuff. So the keyboard isn't great. And I think the worst part about the keyboard not being great is that they, while not changing the design, they updated the keyboard for the 2020 model, and they replaced the keyboard with the new Magic Keyboard that's in all the current models of the MacBook Pro 13 and 16 inch. But when you replace it, there's a program to replace the keyboard on here for free because it's such a problem. When you go to replace it, they replace it with another butterfly keyboard, which is kind of stupid. I mean, at that point, when you're replacing the keyboard, you might as well rip out the entire thing and put a new one in. I know it's more complicated than that, but considering how much of a problem that keyboard has been, definitely that's a thing that really should be looked at. Because yeah, when you go right now to replace it, it's just going to replace it with the current butterfly keyboard, which is again eventually going to break. Next thing, touch bar is kind of important. So the touch bar was the first thing that I commented on. 2018 was the first time the touch bar was in a MacBook Pro. How is that held up in terms of usability and stuff? I mean, I don't really use it. I use it sometimes, rarely, for opening a new tab or changing the color or brightness of the computer, things that are just generally required. But ultimately, no, I don't really use the touch bar that often. But it doesn't really, it doesn't hinder, right? It's not been a thing where certain controls are only available on the touch bar. It's usually just an extension of what the program is. So if it's Final Cut, there'll be the selection tools and the scrubbing of the timeline, that kind of stuff, but you can still do that with the normal interface. There hasn't been things that are oh, you need to use the touch bar. I'm pretty sure certain things are required on the touch bar, like the keyboard brightness and stuff. But with the new macOS Big Sur, this control panel at the top has a lot of the brightness and sound things that you really couldn't get. You couldn't change the brightness, I don't think, of the screen without using that sort of slider thing, unless you went into the settings, which is kind of annoying. But now you can with that control bar, so that's good. So I don't really use the touch bar. It hasn't really hindered or hurt or changed anything. My configuration is something I want to talk about. So how's the config that I made working? How's it like holding up? I basically chose the standard RAM 8 gigs, the standard 256 gig SSD, normal butterfly keyboard. Everything else is pretty standard. Didn't upgrade the processor or anything. But yeah, I chose the 2.3 gigahertz 8th gen Intel Core i5 and then the Intel Iris Plus 655 graphics card thing. That configuration has surprisingly held up pretty well, I think, except for the storage actually is the one thing that I'm noticing. Like, yeah, RAM is obviously useful and important. I haven't really luckily gotten into points where it feels like, oh, I need more RAM, or the RAM is something that is limiting my ability to, do videos and stuff. It's actually really been the storage, right? One of my videos, the Stadia deep dive, I was going to try to make that 4K. By the end of all my editing and stuff, when I was making that 4K, it was going to be about over 200 gigs of data, and I didn't have that free on storage. I had about 150. So I basically went and, I had to like refactor, whatever. Basically, the RAM hasn't really been a problem. The storage has been a problem. I like more storage. I like the storage to be upgradable. But other than that, everything else is kind of held up. I recommend if you're going to get this now at like a cheaper price, get more RAM, get more storage. Those are always a benefit. Speed is another thing. How is the speed held up from the processor and stuff? Pretty well. Actually, I wouldn't say there's things that I'm like, oh, this is super slow now compared to stuff that's on the market currently. Because again, Intel hasn't been great with their whole chip stuff. I haven't tried the new M1 Max. That's a whole nother topic about like ARM and that kind of stuff and how that works. Even if it's quicker, if it's actually quicker in a lot of applications, but speed for the Intel chips hasn't really changed. So the overall speed of the device hasn't felt slow. Things still load correctly. I'm not waiting for things to like keep up, right? I'm not waiting for like Final Cut Pro to realize what I'm doing or Motion to load assets and stuff. It's been pretty consistent with the speed compared to something you might buy current year. Bugs and errors are kind of an interesting thing. I actually haven't noticed a ton of bugs and errors for this device. I've noticed some issues connecting to an external display, which I'm using now, where the when it restarts, because sometimes it'll restart for like updates or whatever at night when you're not using it, but yeah, sometimes it'll like not recognize my keyboard or any of the peripherals that are plugged into the monitor itself. I think that's just more of a connection between the monitor and the computer more than it is the computer to the monitor, or like the connection between the peripherals to the monitor and that to the laptop versus the laptop to the monitor and that kind of connection. But yeah, sometimes it won't recognize that stuff and I have to go in and open up the laptop. Yeah, so other than that, there's been very little bugs I've encountered. Sometimes apps will randomly crash, but that's not really onto the laptop. And any software errors, that's mainly due to certain issues in the program's notes. So durability has been great. Obviously, it's made of metal. Hasn't really had any scuffs or scratches. I've protected the top with a D-brand skin, not sponsored. Yeah, but durability has been really good. The keyboard, even though I hate it, has still kept up well. Hasn't like broken yet. Sides and stuff made of metal. Everything is good. The speakers are great. The screen does get dirty sometimes, but overall the screen is held up nicely. It hasn't, none of the weird screen tearing effects, I guess you could say, that are introduced that some people had where like the backlight or the spotlight or something was messed up, but none of that, so that's good. Durability overall excellent. Software or macOS has been pretty good as well. Things I like about it: quick start, restart times. You can choose when you update. It has good virtualization for stuff. Unix based, so relatively runs code and things pretty well. But yeah, that's basically it for software. There's Apple Arcade and stuff. Software support has been obviously great. Final Cut and other things have been really good. Updating, right? You buy it once and then you have to spend like a monthly thing to get all your stuff. Apps have updated well to the new macOS Big Sur things, except Audacity for some reason. But yeah, everything else has been really good with the software. Software updates are clean, they're consistent, they don't break things, so yeah, it's good. The last thing I want to talk about to wrap up this video is the value and if you should buy it in 2021. So I originally said in my original review that the value of this device was not worth it at $1,800 if you don't have a student discount, or $1,700 if you do, because it was really expensive. I still think it's pretty expensive, and even now the biggest sort of nail to the coffin for this machine is that in 2020 they updated it with double the storage, double the RAM, a new processor, but most importantly a new keyboard for the same exact price. So if you were to buy this same machine in 2020, you'd have double the RAM and double the storage, which is incredible, and I'm a little mad that I can't get that now. RAM, again, not a big deal. Storage would have been fantastic, especially since the SSD is held up really well. The speed of it is fantastic. Still great. Still loads things pretty quickly. But yeah, double RAM, double storage, a new processor, that doesn't really matter. But then that new keyboard as well for the 2020 edition. So overall, in terms of value, if you can get this used for like, I'd say $1,200-$1,300, I would say yeah, it's probably worth it. But if you can't, then you might as well just buy a new 2020 one. So that's also going into the second point. Should you buy in 2021? Absolutely not, because you have the 2020 edition one for consistency. People are saying, oh, why not the M1? The M1 has a bunch of contingencies, like the fact that every program you want to use on the Mac would have to be compatible with M1 and not have a huge hit to performance, among other things. Performance hit, usability of general software and stuff, the limited configuration options, among just unproven stability in terms of not the M1 chip in terms of performance, but the M1 chip in terms of like how long Apple's going to actually support this sort of test run with the M1 stuff. So I'd say 2020 MacBook Pro with the 16 gigs. I think it's DDR4 instead of 3 memory, and then the 512 gig super speed SSD, new chip, and that kind of stuff is really what you want to go for. Still has the touch bar, still has four Thunderbolt 4 ports. But yeah, ultimately, if you want to get one of these and you're thinking it might be interesting, that's absolutely the one you want to go for. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like retrospective things on my previous reviews, like the microphone that I'm using now, or some other products that I've bought, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment down below that information.